Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and every other damn thing that isn't even captured by those old-fashioned categories. I'm Layman Pascal, and this is a very special episode of the Integral Stage, getting to know my compatriot Mark Campbell, who, like me, puts the maple syrup back in Game B. Mark reached out to me in response to some of the conversations I've been having around the principles and problems of scaling and implementing the religion that is not a religion. He was interested in proposing and getting some feedback on the Promethean concept of farsighted self-interest as maybe a basic orienting principle and potential description of the general processes that need to be cultivated if we have our eye on a robust, transsectarian, science-friendly cultivation of wisdom and transformation, and a spirituality that emphasizes future-oriented presencing. So that's what we're going to talk about. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Layman. Wow, you said you'll do a little bit of an introduction, and that I just sat there and thought, wow, he's just freestyle rapping. It's very entertaining. And then I thought, well, yeah, that makes sense, and that, and that, and that. So first of all, I want to just rechristen you MC Layman. And if that catches on, well,
I'll take it. We'll know who to blame if that catches on. Why don't you, if you're comfortable with this, give people a little sense of where you are and what are the kinds of ideas that turn you on? Why are you in a discussion like this?
Oh man, that's I don't know where to start with that. Yeah, yes, I do actually. When I was in grade 11 or grade 10 in Montreal, I remember there was a religion teacher, Sister Barbara Fiond was her name. And I remember my friend and I, because we were in the reserves at the time, and whatever little money we had was concentrated on getting drunk and maybe expanding our chances with girls. And so that was the topic of our conversation or whatever. So we paid little attention to her. But at some point, I remember she asked who thinks about death, and that caught my friend's attention. And he put up his hand. He was the only one in the class, and every day, so he put up his hand again. I thought, well, that's interesting. So it's one of those moments that kind of it pulls you out of the mist, as Jung might say. And so I then listened to her next statement, and she talked about how it is a good thing to contemplate death, and also how it awakens you to the gift of life and contributing to the world. And she said, you change the world whether you like it or not. If you are miserable to 10 people in a day, that stays with them and ripples in their interactions with 10 people and their next 10 people that they meet. And I started doing the math in my head, and I thought, this is interesting. And I started paying attention. And she said, if you treat the next people that you meet with unconditional love, it will ripple out to the next 10 people they meet and the next 10 people that each one of them meets, and so on, until those ripples have affected millions in the world. You have changed the world. And I sat with that, and that became the basis of, if you want to call it spirituality, I think I thought of it as spirituality then until I read the one book I did from Carl Jung, which is Origins and History of Consciousness, which leads me now to ground it more in science, although some people don't think of Jung as that kind of a grounded scientist, but I certainly. And so, anyways, I'll shorten it. The idea then, to me, I thought of enlightened self-interest because that seemed to match, but there was a problem with that, in that enlightened mean that you could instantly know. And that seemed impossible to me. What was possible was to get a sense of where to use a term, probably the only other philosopher that jumps into my mind, because I'm not really a big student of philosophy, but Pirsig's idea of quality. So that in any moment, something about a picture or music or an idea or a feeling will guide people towards this thing feels right. And so I thought, in any moment, that could be anyone that has that feeling. So I started thinking about that and looking for that around me, and it the closest I could find was game B through different people. Jordan Peterson, I think, was the first one, but I think he's gone this way for me, or quality pulled me somewhere else. And then Game B and John Vervaeke and you and others. And I got to give a shout out to, I think his name is Joe Lightfoot. He did that map and he called it, dubbed this the liminal web. And I thought, that's it, it's perfect. Because I'm pulled towards uncertainty. So that's, and then watching your piece on the religion that is not a religion. And John Vervaeke's statement that it has to be something that pulls us rather than pushes us. And Jim Rutt's statement that the great attractor, when everything is unsettled, that will have people walk towards something that will benefit everyone. And Daniel Schmachtenberger's talk about the next stage of human development, where everyone has this sense that this is the way it's kind of got to be. It doesn't make sense any other way. And another, the Three Stooges, when Curly was hitting his head against the wall and Mo said, "Why do you do that?" And he said, "Because it feels so good when I stop," is that we're going to try everything else until we get to that point where we find something that really, really works. And that to me is the idea of farsighted self-interest, that it just makes sense from, and this is something I heard from Alan Watts too, is if you go deep into selfishness, what you'll find is it's so interconnected that you go, "Oh, I need these people and these people and these people." So at different stages, I think this thing can be a heuristic that is the religion that is not a religion. That give me your people who can't make sense of things, and we will make them into people who can make sense of things. Give me your non-people. I think that's the way John put it. Anyways, I try to make it short, but
that was great. There's so many themes that I'm sure we'll come back to a bunch. Something that resonates with me a lot is the problematization of the difference between selfish and altruistic. Nietzsche tried to deconstruct altruism and show how it's in a continuum with selfishness. And like I said in my email to you, I think that's really resonated as well with what Ken Wilber did in terms of thinking of these expanded selves, in which case each expanded self is relatively altruistic from the point of view of a smaller self, but that its new selfishness is bigger. So it looks altruistic, but it's actually more selfishness.
Oh, I love that. That's yeah, I absolutely love that. The only caveat that I would say to that is that that seems, what is it? It feels so intellectual that it's unrelatable for some.
Yeah.
And so my sense is that a 5-year-old could be the teacher.
Yeah.
In any moment, and have that connection to that quality that doesn't need that description, but encapsulates. She's living that.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing then that makes this possible to be that religion that's not a religion, and grounded in science.
There's something about it that's simultaneously distributed to all of the sensors, all of the organisms, all of the beings, and something that's aspirational and something that's descriptive.
Yeah.
I want to come back to that, but I thought I would maybe I would ramble for a couple of minutes and give my standard picture, which would let you know what my standard picture is, but also clear the deck for me so that I don't have to be beholden to that picture anymore.
just wrap, just go.
Yeah. So because this idea of the attractor is what's on my mind. I'm thinking about how I approach telos, because I've had a lot of conversations with Steve McIntosh about the evolution of values.
For me.
And I tend to be somewhat ambivalent about telos in that I go both ways. I think there is a lot of room for teleology in science that's been neglected for a few hundred years, but also a lot of irrational telos that still needs to be cleansed.
Layman.
I think we maybe don't even need those terms anymore. Like if we think like Einstein, we're thinking of a dynamic relativistic interaction with the slope of reality that could be described in some contexts as approaching an attractor and in other contexts as being pushed from behind by the mutual constraint of forces. It's two faces in a vase as far as I'm concerned. I'm very, in a way, Nietzschean about how I like to describe it. I think of a will to power, an abstract proto-subjective correlate to the behavior of energy, which collects and integrates and discharges potentials in a relational matrix of interpretations and perspectival appropriations of form. And so I'm thinking of all of these basic flow holons as having an orientation to flow, to experiencing the intensification of the empowerment feeling of beingness and capacity that accompanies a locally optimized event of becoming. That was a good sentence. So all these protological events, which I would think of as being patterned to some degree by what I call the metaphysics of adjacency. They're interacting with and mutually constraining each other in ways that cause them to become more entangled into complex higher order teams of collaborative flow. Mm-hmm. And these increasing regimes stack up and increase the overall satisfaction of something like the will to power at increasingly expanded scales and with emergent qualitative properties and in different modes of computation. And eventually this starts to look like organisms preferring to live and thrive, animals bonding, humans recognizing the seductive explanatory power of values, and then the combination of values into enactive virtues and higher order meta values that approach the very limit of our cognition as we stand before a flexible aesthetic set of configurations that are kind of an adaptive target condition for beings and processes, both locally and universally, like operating as a desirable trend over the stochastic field of complex interactions. And I would happily describe all that as the will of God, as the dynamic potential normative elegance orientation of synergetic emergence, which is in no sense a fixed goal or an already written future history, but affords us a productive alignment with a pattern of directional integrative convergence and surplus overflow that operates psychobiologically and cosmically and socially to produce effects such as faith, depth cultivation, meaning, and transfiguration. And because I anchor all that in a discourse like the will to power, this can be seen as an extension of a certain kind of selfishness rather than as a proposed idealistic altruism. And that's where I find a lot of common ground with this idea of farsighted self-interest. So for me, that's the image in the back of my mind, which I can now put to the side.
Wow. Okay, I tried to interrupt you a little bit at the beginning, but it turns out I didn't need to. But I'm going to still ask for an explanation because you're stuff. Just give me a breakdown of telos.
So telos is, when I imagine it like gravitation, right? Like it's as a pulling force. And when I think of strange attractors in fractal computations and things like that, I imagine that also as a kind of, if we're thinking of it as telos, there's a set of patterning configurations which are tending to occur as processes run and interact over time, like gravitation and like attractors in computation. And that the telos, the way I think about it, is not a fixed state, but it's a set of aesthetic configurations. So you could approximate this quality. It's a qualitative telos, right? So there's lots of different ways you could get that same quality, but you have to try to get that quality. That's the overall orientation. Even though it may not dominate in any given moment, the trend is toward that because it's sort of the best fit solution given the parameters that a universe needs in order to actually operate.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes. And yes. So I'm not familiar with all the terminologies that are used in philosophy. or I may have learned them and discarded them because I didn't find them useful. But I like that description of telos, and because again, it fits with there's a quality. This woman, I can't remember her name, but she does this podcast, A Quality Existence, and she talks about Pirsig's novels. One was called one was a quality Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So this idea of a quality thing that you just described is, I think, what Pirsig would call dynamic quality, and what for me fits in with what I have been sensing, and kind of like my expanded body mind. And when I think of evolution itself, well, what are we evolving towards? Well, it seems to me that we're evolving more towards something that looks like farsighted self-interest. I don't know if that's the eventual goal, but it feels like that. That's a couple of philosophers I remember because they stood out so much for me, like David Hume in his critique on inductive reasoning. Why should we believe that because something happens twice in a row that it's going to happen again? And why should we base all science on that? And then there was Kant's reply saying basically, well, that's the way we're arranged, kind of. That's what stuck with me. So I go a little bit, I have my own take on what how Kant resonates with me is that that's how we've evolved to represent the universe. Yeah. So the representation of the universe is in us. So because we've evolved that way, of course, because something happens twice in a row, it's going to happen again. We've evolved that way. We've evolved to interpret the universe that way. And it seems to have served us well. And it feels to me like we're evolving towards that quality of farsighted self-interest. Now, when I read Jung's The Origins and History of Consciousness, the first 200 pages were almost unreadable for me. I would read 3 pages and put it down and go, what is this nonsense? But it was recommended by Jordan Peterson, and I read the foreword. It was by Jung, who said, if you take all my works, look at all the dead ends and places where I went off and wasn't sure of what was going on and realized afterwards, if you took everything and then put it together in one place, this is what you'd have. You'd have this book. You take all the best, this is what you'd have. I thought, well, I gotta just, Carl Jung is saying, read this. And so I persevered through the first 200 pages. And then I remember he mentioned an individual. This is Eric Neumann, by the way, who wrote this book. I should forget that because those are his. It's hard to separate the two. But Eric Neumann was one of Carl Jung's students. So at one point at page 185 or something, I remember he was talking about certain individuals who are, as consciousness evolves, certain individuals who will find that they are so wrapped up in gaining this kind of spiritual connection to everything that these things will happen to them. They will have these side effects that manifest in this way. And it was like reading a description of myself that was so different from anybody else. It wasn't like a fortune cookie. It was, this is you, Mark, and this, and this, and this. Well, maybe not this so much, but this unique thing. And so when I read that, then I started paying closer attention. And so Jung talks about, at the beginning, primitive man, there was so much information in our body minds through evolution, right down to past DNA into our very particles, because I have the sense that every mode of energy is affected by every other mode of energy, to the point that there's kind of like a backwards, if you could unravel it, you could see the history of the universe in every particle, because every bit of energy radiates out in an unlimited way. So then there's all this information that's available to us, so much in our unconscious that we didn't know what to make sense of it. It just was overwhelming. And then there was a point where the ego arose and then evolved as kind of like an organ of consciousness, an organ of awareness, maybe. And so then it evolved to separate out some things from complexity so that it could be studied while learning how to stay alive, and kind of rise up against nature trying to kill us all the time. And so the patriarchy evolved because of that, because he described this as a very masculine part of ourselves, not the male, but a masculine separation of, and this was supported by, feminine cultures throughout history, like you have the women giving white roses to the men who stayed back from the war, saying, "You coward," and also I felt that as well. I felt that in society against, because I do have kind of a sensitive, it feels weird saying it now, but it's a feminine side that I nurture in myself now, because I realize, I leave part out, is that, so Jung called that the scientific method, basically the basis of the scientific method, but he said it had an ending because it would narrow down in rationality so that only the things that were allowed within that rationality could be used to measure what should be in that rationality. And so then that has a dead end. But it still is useful using that kind of strong ego to turn back towards our unconscious and our collective unconscious and meld with that, being led by the feminine. And so when I saw that, I forget what brought me to this point now. That's because I get so wrapped up in that book. But the whole idea that this organ, I know what's going. So the whole evolving was evolving to this next stage of our development, which looks to me like farsighted self-interest, where our sense of connectedness is such that our personal care is inseparable from communal care. Altruism won't even be a thing. You'll say altruism and people will think, well, how is that different? That sounds less than how we live. And a 5-year-old will be able to tell you what that of course way of being is. And so where I see all those things you talk about as something that we're evolving towards, that kind of, it pervades us. It's a will towards a power. Of course it's a power. It's a power that's more powerful than one group of people dominating another, or one group of people saying I'm morally superior to you because I do this and I have empathy and you don't, or I have a way of surviving the world better than you and you're just walking around with your head in the clouds. So all of this, that qualitative attraction, as you call it, that's spinning around out there and through us, and we aspire towards it. We aspire towards it because it's in us. It's in that organ of our consciousness. When John Vervaeke talks about relative realization, where it's like we've narrowed down to say, give me the things that I need to make me survive consciousness, and don't talk too much, or give me the things I need to survive awareness. So consciousness is saying this to awareness, narrow it down, make it simple, because I'm stupid. And I can only take little bits at a time. But this next stage of development is turning towards awareness and consciousness and collective unconscious, and saying, let me have it. Let me have it. I'm ready to surrender to this. And so that feels to me like this stuff, when you were talking about it permeating our bodies, but being out there and in here at the same time and attracting us, that is what we're moving towards.
There's I think there's some ambiguity that might be useful to dig into around like how much of this is already active and how much is potentially active, right? Like, is this an archaic part of ourselves that we all already have? Is it something we can do better or worse? Is it something that we could begin to start doing? When I was a kid, I was really enamored of a British philosopher and science fiction writer named Colin Wilson. And he had this idea about faculty X, about a evolutionary potential to take time more seriously, more viscerally. Right. He thought there were moments in history, like maybe farmers who had to be concerned about the seasons, or people who built pyramids, people who were working on a 1,000-year project, that they had a stronger visceral sense that the future was real. And that maybe today we even have undermined that sense, right? In the same way that we make products so that they will break down and you have to get next year's product. We're deliberately not planning in some way. So there's this idea that we could get this capacity more and more. We could train ourselves. We know there's a future, but we don't always feel it. We certainly don't act like that the next 10 years or the next 1,000 years is as real as the next 10 minutes. So that might be a set of capacities of understanding scale of time that we could grow into. On the other hand, we're at the end of millions of years of evolution in a complex adaptation to this kind of a reality. So we must already have a lot of these capacities built in. One of the things I find most intriguing about Jordan Peterson's ideas is one little notion from his book Maps of Meaning, where he talks about the feeling of meaning as being kind of like a dashboard indicator light. And the light is brighter the more different scales of yourself you're taking into account with your selfishness, right? So if it's good for you and your loved ones now, but also tomorrow and also a year from now, then that dashboard indicator light is brighter. You feel more meaningfulness. And that suggests it's already there. It's already active. It's already built in. You just have to discern it. So what's your feeling about, how present it already is versus how good or not good we are at doing it versus the potential for us to become great at this?
I love that. I love that, actually. I'm just letting it settle into me. I remember him the first time when he said it, it switched something on in me. That pay attention. The idea, he talked about that Russian scientist and the orienting reflex and how that sensed that, yes, this is meaningful. It feels to me like it's always been there, and it's come to us through many religious texts. The idea that, Buddhism certainly, but Christianity, when Jesus said there was only 2 commandments, love God and love thy neighbor as thyself. Muhammad at, where was it, Medina, where he gathered all the people that were exiles, and together, Jews, everybody, gathered them together to face this army that was going to wipe them out and somehow miraculously won. Considering each other and bypassing our differences. The idea of the Tao, which is just crazy. The Tao being this quality feels like a negative space, actually, when I think about it. The idea that there could be, when you strip away everything, all the rest of the noise, or this kind of sense of morality, I have to be this way, what will be revealed is this kind of magical, divine way of being that flows through the universe and with the universe and in us, and will manifest differently, everyone, but will manifest in such a way that will kind of be this harmonious, divine, kind of highest morality and divinity that we could imagine, like a heaven on earth. And so it definitely feels like it's there. Yeah, it feels like it's always been there, but it's been like a judge. It's like a harsh judge that we can't look at in the face, like a gorgon that will turn us to stone. We don't fully understand it. How is doing this thing that looks altruistic going to help me and my future selves and align with my past selves and all of that? It especially when the noise of now is really rigged to just hijack our limbic systems and just drive materialism right down to the level of our genes, probably turning on and turning off some genetic code that will attract us more towards materialism. So I think yes, yes, and yes. However, what we're facing right now, this environment, there's so much noise. At the same time, there's this kind of the liminal web and everything that is waking up. It's almost like it's being called forth, and other things too. It might be going on in kitchens in Scotland, and a friend of mine knits things, Kerry Santo and Game B. She has these little groups that get together and help out homeless and things like that. So it's percolating and emerging everywhere at the same time as this kind of oppressive noise and polarization, which I think is our biggest existential threat, is happening. So yes, yes, and yes.
Let's talk a little bit more about the role of experts versus everyone in this, right? Because there seem to be different functions that would be needed in order to take this project further in the future, right? We need moderators, we might need exemplars, there might be savants who are notably good at doing it, but at the same time, there might be all kinds of people and more than people who are able to just find how to take that next step for themselves appropriately, and that the real evolutionary progress is the sum total of all those correct steps, regardless of what they look like. So that on the one hand, you have somebody knitting, and on the other hand, you have what seems to be a very spiritually active, great developmental philosopher, right? We need some way of saying that both of those could be doing the right thing, and both of those could be doing the wrong thing. So how do we think about that? What's your sense of the affordances and risks of having expertise, and the idea of special moderators, and the affordances and risks of not having them?
See, I thought about that when I watched you and John and Brendan talk about this, and at first I discarded it. I thought, well, I think it should be all intuitive. That's another thing we could have a discussion. I'm trying to get rid of the word should out of my vocabulary and just kind of walk forward in a kind of radical acceptance and then towards an intention, but knowing fully that with that uncertainty, the quality could show itself in a different way. Okay, that being said, the idea that there could be institutions that help us get there, I'm much more warm to that now. It feels like something that could be very useful, as long as they hold uncertainty in that way. If they could hold uncertainty as the thing above all else, and allow that it could be a 5-year-old child or a lady in Scotland that knits hats and socks that has that quality, and have the humility to bow to the divinity in anyone that comes into their sphere of influence. So if that can be had, then yes. If that can be incorporated, then yes, because you guys were talking about if they had universities that taught some of these ancient methodologies. You have to be careful with those, right? Because anytime I went to the Willow Monastic Academy, and I remember feeling, number one, cared for there, and it was the only place I could express that I cared for everyone, and it was actually magical to be able to say that and not feel weird. But at the same time, I felt my sense of agency being unsettled by the chanting and by different things going on, and by something in the back of our mind saying, is this a cult? This is weird. It feels like a cult. And I remember my fourth or fifth day there, it might have been longer than that. I had this kind of, it wasn't a meltdown. It was I woke up and I thought, well, this is all bullshit. Why am I even here? This is all this chanting. I'm putting my chair in the right place. What the hell is this all about? And I remember they have this check-in in the morning, and somebody had said that because there's this feeling in those communities and in different places that humans are not kind enough to animals, and maybe some humans don't deserve as much care or warmth, and that annoys me. I just viscerally, it just gets me. And when I see people bowing to deities or prostrating themselves on their hands and knees and their heads crawling towards the Dalai Lama, I just want to grab them and shout in their face, that you are the divinity. You are the key to your salvation and mine. Don't look to anybody else. And so that day, I remember I told the leader, she's a wonderful person, beautiful soul, actually. She'd been talking about a pet cat, and I said the previous day, I remember saying, all these people in places like this that have a sense that what they're doing is better than anybody else, and they have pets at home. How do they know what those pets want? Do you know that's very much like what slavery was a couple of 100 years ago? People said, my slaves are so happy you can hear them sing. To me, it seems like cats can be slaves.
Yeah.
And I remember saying that cats are, and I remember the hurt look on her face. And I had that, so I had that moment, and it felt like I gained my agency back. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting, because what was that loss of agency? It was because it felt like now months, a year later, and I will likely go back. And that's something they are going to have to deal with, is that they're going to have to know, and maybe in the bell curve, I'm on the tail end, one of those people who's, just because of the way my mind works, makes me that unsettling, more magnified and pronounced. So that's something that I think that all of those institutions are going to have to deal with, is the knowledge that, especially because of this time and because it's so different from what you're facing, that might have been fine 200 years ago, but right now, because of what you're facing, all this limbic hijacking and all of this telling you that this is the other way to go, that's just like a cesspool in us. So this is something that's going to have to be dealt with. So I think one way of dealing with is that opening that door to all new members, in that, okay, come to us, but bring us your knowledge of what's happening in you now and how you think that could be addressed. And if you need to have a care space, just go there. If you're unsettled, just go there. You don't even have to say anything to anybody. This is a beautiful care space, and we're going to honor that. And you can come back out, and then we want to hear the wisdom you gained by going to that care space, because it's a beautiful space, and it's a beautiful thing that you went there, and something like that. But just knowing that those things can happen. I think these places are absolutely necessary right now. I should probably shut up and talk.
I hear sort of two things there as a requirement for setting up spaces. One of them is this acknowledgement of uncertainty that goes along with all of the complexity theory and informational opacity, and just like we're learning a lot of like new Socratism, in the sense of our studies of math and the cosmos and the mind is showing us that we really have to be constantly interacting with the limits of our understanding, that nobody's in an absolute position. There's always going to be surprises and black swans and complex interactions that come out of nowhere. And somebody else, the other, always potentially has something you need to know but don't know. So really being able to psychologically and physiologically be open to what uncertainty is, and to have an open discourse that's at a high level of sophistication, that's trans-oppositional maybe, right? So that when you come into a group, everybody can have a conversation about collaborative sovereignty, which helps mitigate against going too much into sovereignty against the group, or too much into the group against sovereignty. Like if we can have that post dichotomy discourse, then we're in a much more secure place, because then we can at least talk to each other about, oh, I want to focus on this right now, or maybe this has gone a little bit too much this way, but the opposite is also important. So I think both of those are really important for setting up spaces, which, like you say, I agree, they're absolutely necessary. We need a much richer, more robust set of these supportive and developmental spaces. When it comes to you mentioned that methodologies are tricky. I like that, right? Because there's a sense in which almost any practice could be done in service of our discerning alignment with our own qualitative assessment, right? Like, am I going to do the meditation according to what I deeply know about how the meditation should work, rather than just wasting a lot of time doing someone else's meditation tactic, which isn't really going to benefit me at all? So that's one side. But the other side is, I have a lifetime and an evolutionary history of resistances and inhibitions and ego defenses that so I might be served by things that seem to thwart me as well. So that's a very interesting team, those two things.
Yes. And I love that, because so I would go back and commit to my teacher only because I know what because she's the same as me in many ways. She's suffering all that uncertainty and everything from the world coming in, but moving ahead and dedicating her time towards this in spite of that. And so I would go there and say, okay, I'm just gonna submit to your teaching to help me shift, because that's what I found was shifting in me when I was there. The idea that something I called a status map. It's a mixture of what Jordan Peterson was talking about, but it's a status hierarchy map, and it's got mimetic behavior in there. So I know that I have in me certain people or certain attitudes that I aspire towards unconsciously, and it happens, and I go, well, when I catch it in myself, sometimes I'm going, why is that even happening? You know, why do I live minimally, but parts of me go, oh, that's a nice place, that's a really nice pool, you know, and you so and why is that still happening? You know, when I was there, I felt it shifting. So this, and I think what was happening is when I'm subjected to everything else from the material world and the limbic hijacking, it sets up a status hierarchy map that my being kind of mimics the behavior that will take me there. When I was at Willow, I found that was shifting. The people and the ideas that I found myself unconsciously wanting to mimic were shifting. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So how what else would I need to do in my life to shift that? And so I became more minimalistic. Signed off from the internet for longer, although YouTube has got me again. It's just I go down that YouTube rabbit hole. It just, but so anyway, there was a second part to your question. I forget. Did I answer?
I'm not sure I even asked a question. I threw some distinctions into the mix, and I think you've responded to them.
Yeah.
One of the things we discussed a little bit in email was what I called wide-sighted self-interest, right? And far-sighted can have different connotations, right? Often we're thinking about further extensions of time, right? What is it that I can treat as a good intuitive prompt in this moment that will extend the interests of this self in a way that are better for people and myself over longer ranges of time, rather than just satisfying to me over very short periods of time.
Mhm.
But far can also be a spatial, as I can see far away in this moment. So there's something about the current multiplicity of ourselves that's important to include. And we could call that another form of farsightedness, or we could reserve farsighted for time and call this wide-sightedness, because I not only need to take my self-interest seriously as something that extends over human futures, but I need to take it seriously as something that extends over multiple persons that I care about in larger scales right now, and multiple aspects of myself, or even multiple selves that might occupy or utilize this organism. So there's a sense in which the farsightedness has to have a very flexible, large, and diverse sense of what a self is.
Yeah, and that makes me think of Jung's ideas, and I have that feeling, that embodied feeling. So we talked about the hermaphrodite straddling both realms or both ways of being, to kind of guide us into this kind of surrender to the unconscious. I love the wide-sided idea, because there's so many parts of me that seem to be so opposed to each other sometimes. And I love the imagery of the wide-sided because it takes that into consideration. So my business self feels different than my liminal web self. And I want them to be more in alignment. And I feel like this wide-sided self-interest, the heuristic of it, and just kind of holding that image would help bring those things in. You know, like sexuality, there is one, right, that just takes over your whole body like a possession sometimes. So what will bring that into alignment so that this sexual gratification is enhanced, let's say, by this kind of wide-sided and far-sided self-interest, taking all of that. Dig deeply as you can into selfishness without trying to color it with, I'm going to be good to others. Try not to color it. Dig as deep as you can into selfishness, widely and far. And hopefully, and I'm, I'm saying hopefully, it feels to me like you'll come up with far-sighted and wide-sided self-interest that manifests itself in something like what Jordan Peterson was mentioning, that orienting reflex that says, yes, this is meaningful, and this feels healthy and whole, and it has that, it calls to us like that quality of Pirsig. This is where I intend to move, because this, accepting everything that's in me, I intend to move in this direction, because it has the quality and the kind of beauty that appeals to me and pulls me and says, you'll be good here.
What do you think are good exercises in terms of a person getting better at finding and, in a way, disciplining themselves to follow the right kind of inner prompting?
Hmm. Well, definitely some of the ancient practices, meditation. I'll likely be going back to Willow for a little bit. But just taking the time to pause. There's a practice called insight dialogue, which I think is just, it's magical. You know, and you know those online dialogues I do. I haven't recorded any yet, but valuing somebody else's ideas and opinions, especially if you detest them. What is useful out of all that noise? And just engaging in that practice of pausing and listening to what's going on in the kind of body mind that wants to emerge, because that's where your wisdom lies. And I think and that's a practice you can do all the time. I'll just stop there.
What I like about that is it comes back to this notion of being more responsible about time, right? You're taking more time with something, and therefore you can discern its richness more deeply, and you can make evaluations within it more carefully and find what you wanted in that moment much more precisely than if you just zoomed past it.
In that moment, yes. In that moment, yes.
Yeah. Now, there's another side to taking time in a more responsible way, and that's sort of building up a capacity to exert what we might still want to call the will over longer spans of time. It's one of the things that comes up in a lot of esoteric and religious training, is this notion of taking on a practice or a responsibility or a discipline. It could be caused by you or it could be received from someone else, but you're going to do this for a period of time. And it's not too different than saying, I'm going to paint a portrait, right? I've established an intention and I'm going to commit myself, regardless of how I feel in various moments, to completing a task, to extending my ability to have effects over longer ranges of time. And if I have more of that capacity, then my intuition, assuming I'm in connection with it, can then exert itself over these longer ranges of time if I have that competence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think setting out that intention by itself and having the quiet moments with that intention will build that, as you say. Yeah. That's what I find is personally happening in me. I'm trying to get rid of should. I remember in Insight Dialogue, we were talking about uncertainty, because that's why liminal web really appeals to me. Is he said, one of his teachers said, uncertainty is the only container large enough to hold us all. And it makes perfect sense to me. It also makes sense to me that everything I know was incomplete or wrong. And, you know, it's not just an opinion. It's based on the fact that you look at all the greatest minds throughout history, and everything has been proven incomplete or wrong by these brilliant, brilliant people. So am I more brilliant than them? No. So then where does that leave me? Well, it leaves me with this kind of beautiful acceptance of where I am, and this kind of love for uncertainty that's going to usher in the wisdom of the next moment, and kind of curating my own life so that it is open to that, more and more open to that. As you say, you talk about painting this big picture.
If everything can be shown to be incomplete or wrong, is that also true of your deepest intuition?
That's such a good question. Yes. I say yes, and then it doesn't make any sense when I say yes, but it feels like a yes. I think the deepest wisdom that can come, it's going to feel like a beautiful rose or a beautiful creature that is with us, and I guess it should feel like that. But the minute somebody comes and says, that is so wise, then it kind of begins to shake you. And that's when it needs to become a dead thing on the road that is rotting. And so that you can just leave it and look for the next thing in the next moment.
It's very, I mean, this is a sensibility that's been with us at least since Socrates tried to deconstruct the idea that people thought he was the wisest man in Athens. That in order to really be a responsible embodiment of any kind of wisdom, you've got to unpack ideas that people have about you and your own sensibility that you might be wise, because you're always at risk of locking down things and too much and becoming unwise. And that's a very interesting practice, because it asks us to be ambiguous. It asks us to be unsure. It asks us to be vulnerable, not so much that we lose agency or that we can't stand behind an idea, but it means that that impressive thing that our cognitive biases lean into about someone who expresses certainty, that we want to decompress that. And maybe that once in a while that's a useful thing, but we should always be extremely wary of the person who absolutely seems to know, even if because they're preying on our errors, our evolved cognitive errors, and our sense that we don't have complete confidence is a very good thing and not a problem to be solved by borrowing someone else's appearance of complete confidence. It's something we should be treasuring and utilizing to be more nuanced and sensitive navigators.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. And it feels right to be all in on this intention to just honor this space with Layman and taking this time, and anybody who's watching, and that intention feels right, and that feels wise, and it feels good, and it feels energizing. I'm all in on that. There's no shakiness to that feeling. It feels like a ground I could stand and die on. So it's not that uncertainty leaves us shaky. It feels like the opposite.
Yeah, I agree with the not caveat, but with the footnote that it's an unforced reliability.
Yeah.
I think that's how it has to be. Sometimes I think faith and belief are opposites in a way, right? That a belief is a kind of pretend certainty that you ascribe to in order to not experience uncertainty, whereas faith is your capacity to make uncertainty workable in some sense, right? When you pick up a hammer or like an axe, you know how nice an axe handle is. It's got that little curve. You're like, oh, I could chop something with this, right? It feels extremely reliable, but it's not trying to sell you on anything.
Yeah. So, and the reliability, and that's an interesting point, because that goes back to Pirsig's idea of a quality that is recognizable by everyone, and that's in the game B world. I'm trying to create this, this idea of this stealth proto B, a kind of a global community, and it would be kind of like the liminal web, I suppose, where people are supportive of each other and give each other the advantage of community. Place to get together online, even if you're in Sweden. I know a guy in Austria. And I mean, if you're traveling, it'd be like early Christians, you have a place to stay sometimes, or maybe they'll provide you with things or software or exchange of funds or business. And the idea being that what is driving this is this quality of this is a thing that could affect positive change in the world. It's for me, it furnishes me with that kind of reliable axe handle to face the future, knowing that I'm not running out on the rest of humanity. Because one of the things that you want to do in this kind of global group is treat your neighbors, even the ones that you find detestable, with as much unconditional love as you can muster. That kind of farsighted self-interest that says, the little tunnel of perspective that you have could help fill out my map so that I benefit and don't die in the future. You know, one of Jordan Peterson's ideas, which I love, and what Robert Anton Wilson and even John Vervaeke's relevance realization takes that into account. So I definitely feel that that is something that it's that dynamic quality that attracts us and moves us forward and feels like that. It feels right. There's no coercion involved. There should be no coercion involved. If it's good, then it'll attract. If it's good, you know, like in the Bible, by their fruits shall you know them, right? So there'll be fruits there.
There's something I find really fascinating about the collusion between the emotional, moral attitude that wants to love others and extend that love. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something immediately personally productive about that. We honor something in ourselves by loving something universal in the other, regardless of the form that they take. But on the other hand, this kind of complementary tactical approach, which is you don't know where the things that you need are going to come from.
Yes.
Right. Or that we all need, right? So neurodiversity and all these kinds of things. You don't know, somebody seems like a lunatic, but you don't know if they're not going to provide the seed of the thing that becomes the thing we all need. So although we can't be perfectly universally inclusive, we have to take responsibility as gatekeepers to some degree. Nonetheless, the practical sphere of things we need to embrace is much larger than what our socialized instinct normally embraces. When we start to think in larger periods of time and go, wow, my God, like who knows who we're going to need? I thought that guy was a dummy, but somebody's got to take that first Mars mission. I'm not going. So yes. Good for him being the way he is.
Yeah. And just by the way she takes on that mission allows me to shift in my perspective so that I have now a wider and more real view of a map of the world, you know. Yeah. It is now 10 past the hour, and I have another thing on the go, Layman. So
that's fantastic. This is an appropriate length of time for anyone to watch or listen. And about 4 minutes ago, there's a spot I like to get to, right? The discussions are great and they're wonderful, and I love who I'm talking to, but there's a spot that comes up in every discussion. It takes as long as it takes for this feeling of intersubjective sweetness to start to arise in me. And I go, oh, there it is. Now it's a successful conversation. That happened about 4 minutes ago. So good. I'm perfectly happy to bring this to an end. It's been lovely talking with you, Mark. I think there's a lot of fertility and utility in the notion of farsighted self-interest, and I'm happy that some people in the community are going to be a little more aware of your qualities after seeing this.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I know you know about my reservations about doing these things, but it was what was it? It feels like what I always look for is a shifting. So it feels like I'm having a shifting in perspective, and I appreciate that. So thank you.